In the years between World War I and World War II, the entire world suffered through one of the greatest economic disasters of the 20th century, the Great Depression. It was an extremely misleading name though, because it was far from great. I'd give it a 2 out of 10. Do not recommend. But in the United States, this period of uncertainty would prompt some of the greatest attempts on the part of the federal government to provide economic relief to its citizens. However, gender ideologies deeply impacted how that relief was carried out.
Welcome to Remedial Herstory, where we ask what happened to the women and put them in. In this series, we tell women's history from era to era from the perspectives of differing and diverse women. Women are half of history. Welcome to Herstory. This episode was sponsored by the New Hampshire Women's Foundation and the patrons of the Remedial Herstory Project.
On October 29, 1929, later referred to as Black Tuesday, the stock market crashed. Within hours, billions of dollars of market value disappeared. Not to be dramatic, but the United States and the rest of the world found itself in the midst of one of the greatest economic catastrophes in modern history. Okay, that was a little bit dramatic, but so was the Great Depression. After Black Tuesday came years of hard times in the United States, but the country hit its low point between 1932 and 1933. Unemployment reached 25%. President Hoover's inaction and philosophy of pulling oneself up from one's bootstraps led to Franklin Delano Roosevelt's landslide victory in the 1932 election. Struggling Americans were about to see much more federal action. President Roosevelt did not have a plan to tackle the Great Depression when he was elected, but he filled his cabinet with a variety of progressives, also known as FDR's brain trust, whom he believed would help shape an effective policy, including the first woman ever to serve in a presidential cabinet, Frances Perkins, Secretary of Labor. It's extremely likely people were confused by her title. She was probably mistaken for a typing secretary at least once, but progress is progress. You go, Secretary Perkins. Perkins was a labor rights activist who had previously volunteered at Chicago's Hull House and served as head of the New York office of the National Consumers League. She is ready to stunt on labor haters. The Depression's impact on the everyday lives of Americans cannot be overstated. Because of the ultra-high unemployment rates, most Americans found themselves out of work or unemployed. But for women, the Depression's effects were compounded by existing gender ideologies. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? A cultural problem that generally is harder on women because of sexism. I guess I'm thinking of pretty much everything. So here's the scoop. Most women felt increased family pressures as they tried to make do with reduced income. Plus, most women still had their child-rearing household obligations, and many of the opportunities that the federal government offered to aid American citizens were closed off to them. Regardless, many women's ability to earn a wage in whatever capacity they could was often essential to helping their families get through this challenging time. Are you tired just thinking about what all women were trying to carry at once? Same. Great Depression-era women were better jugglers than Cirque du Soleil. In his first 100 days in office, FDR's priority was to confront the baking crisis. Decent start, but his actions weren't enough. Congress had to pass laws and create agencies to stimulate the economy, build up infrastructure, put Americans to work, and boost morale. His critics were scathing in their reviews. Most Americans are familiar with some of these alphabet agencies like the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the PWA, the Public Works Administration, and the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. These agencies are A-OK. Sorry, that was a bad joke. But for real, super helpful agencies. They were critically important to stabilizing the economy. Their downside? They pretty much explicitly excluded women. The CCC, one of the most well-known and well-studied agencies of the New Deal, only hired young men between the ages of 17 and 23. The Civil Works Administration, the CWA, was a little bit more lax, but they still almost exclusively hired men. Because of existing gender ideologies, women's roles were mostly limited to those of housewife and mother. Consequently, those in positions of power didn't really consider women in an economic recovery package, and many of the New Deal programs were not initially directed at them. Oops. An extremely insensitive oops. Some women did get to take advantage of New Deal programs, mostly via the Works Progress Administration. Some of the best known WPA projects were federal artistic projects like theater, music, dance, murals, and historical or tourist guidebooks. However, even at the program's peak, women only represented about 14% of WPA employees. Womp womp, sad trombone. But at least the sad trombonist may have been employed by a government-supported band. Generally, women were limited to jobs that fit within existing gender ideologies. They were considered unsuitable for physically demanding jobs like heavy construction. In Federal Emergency Relief Administration camps, or FERA, women's work included canning foods, sewing, producing clothes and mattresses, or working as housekeeping aides for families in need of additional help. You know, girly activities. Girls love canning, am I right, ladies? Of course, these gender limitations on girls were compounded with racial stereotypes. For example, most of the FERA employees who worked as housekeeping aides were African American women. It's difficult to measure the New Deal's impact on women when essentially the New Deal wasn't written for them, or even with them in mind. And then, get this, between 1932 and 1937, there were laws against more than one person per married couple working for the federal service. Meaning, if both parties of a couple were earning the sweet, sweet New Deal cash, they'd have to decide who would quit their job between them. Tough call, am I right? Well, since the National Recovery Administration set lower minimum wages for women than men performing the exact same jobs, it then, of course, rarely made sense for women to keep their jobs over their husbands' higher-paying work. You'd simply hate to see it. So hang on, what about our cabinet queen, Frances Perkins? Remember, she was the Secretary of Labor. How did the first female presidential cabinet member feel about this? Well, it's complicated, but surprisingly, Perkins shared some of the same anti-work for women views as her male colleagues, particularly for married women. At one point, she even said,
"The woman pin money worker who competes with the necessity worker is a menace to society, a selfish, short-sighted creature who ought to be ashamed of herself."
Pump the brakes, Perkins. Menace? Creature? Are you describing some nice lady named Deborah trying to make ends meet with a part-time job, or a demonic woodland goblin? While Perkins' statement might sound like an indictment against women workers, she was mostly opposed to married women who held jobs. Perkins also said,
"I am not willing to encourage those who are under no economic necessity to compete with their charm and education, their superior advantages, against the working girl who has only her two hands."
Basically, Perkins believed if women were married, ideally they wouldn't need to work. Their husbands should provide for them. However, if women were alone, they needed the ability to earn a decent living to protect themselves. The time-honored tradition of pitting women against each other is live and well. Perkins wasn't the only one displeased with working women. The targeting of women workers was broad scapegoating. Traditional women's jobs were less connected to the stock market and less affected by its crash than, say, coal mining or manufacturing. So while men were losing their jobs, women in some industries simply weren't. This point was lost on many, though. Journalist Norman Cousins once wrote,
"Simply fire the women who shouldn't be working anyway and hire the men. Presto! No unemployment, no relief rolls, no depression."
Cousins' short-sighted comment ignored that a coal miner or steel worker couldn't or wouldn't exactly fit the job requirements of a clerical worker or nurse. To quote Cousins, presto, no logic. The New Deal's effect on women cannot be just determined by job quotas or gendered minimum wages. The Social Security Act, one of the landmark pieces of the New Deal legislation, and the Fair Labor Standards Act did not initially even cover sectors of employment where women were disproportionately represented: agricultural work and domestic service. Furthermore, women who were not dependent on men got fewer Social Security benefits. This weird program structure seemed to suggest women deserved economic rights only in relation to men. TBH, women seemed to be in a lose-lose coming out of the Great Depression. They were often forced to take on more central roles within their homes and families, playing unrecognized roles in helping the country through the Great Depression. Or they were working for less money than their male peers and possibly being despised just for having jobs at all. Although the Depression was a time for many strong women to step up to the plate in their home and workplaces, ultimately the Depression did not subvert traditional gender roles. It only reinforced them. them. But before we get too, well, depressed, let's talk about a small depression win for women. In 1933, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt wrote, "It's up to the women." First of all, amazing title and timeless. Secondly, this was really the first time a First Lady took action to speak on a current crisis. Women were rarely in positions of power to speak out, so Eleanor Roosevelt's actions were quite modern and reshaped our expectations of White House First Ladies. In It's Up to Women, Roosevelt provided a handbook for women during the Great Depression. It was inspirational at times, but mostly it was practical. It provided inexpensive meal plans, recipes, instructions, and most importantly, put forward the idea that women did have the power to shape their homes and their destinies. She believed that these trying times would help women forge strong characters. She wrote,
"The women know that life must go on and that the needs of life must be met, and it is their courage and determination which, time and again, have pulled us through worse crises than the present one."
Translation, ladies, we've been through some stuff. If we've made it through that, we can make it through the depression. That said, it's important to remember, as we've already touched on, women's experiences of this hard time varied greatly by many factors. Women's age, marital status, geographic location, race, and ethnicity all affected how complicated a woman's chance of surviving the difficult Great Depression circumstances were. For example, an urban housewife with electricity and running water might have been on the struggle bus, but she arguably still had an easier time than a similarly struggling rural woman who also had to deal with the lack of these conveniences. The typical married woman in the 1930s had a husband who was still employed, but who likely took pay cut or reduced hours to keep his job. If he had lost his job, often the family had enough resources to survive without going on relief or losing all of their possessions. Nearly every woman, rich or poor, faced a reduction in income. For some women, though, this reduction of income and the effects of the Depression were more extreme than others. Many Black Americans obviously experienced the Depression differently than white people. Many of them were already struggling under the yoke of discrimination and prejudice. Even before Black Tuesday, Black Americans had way fewer job opportunities than white people because of racism. Times were already hard, but they became harder. Time for another mini win, though. Charlotta Bass was born in Sumter, South Carolina in 1874. In 1910, she moved to Los Angeles, California, where she became the owner of the California Eagle, a Los Angeles-based newspaper for LA's growing African-American community. She became a prominent figure in the community and organized a campaign to promote Black employment by urging readers to only shop at places that hire Black employees. She sought to reinvigorate the insular Black economy in Los Angeles. Yes, Charlotta. Her efforts were mirrored in other communities with large African-American populations. These movements did make change, but overall, Black Americans still had an unemployment rate that was twice that of white Americans, while simultaneously benefiting less from government relief and public works projects than their white counterparts. Meanwhile, President Roosevelt was at least attempting to improve Black rights in the US. He himself hired Black Americans and placed critics of segregation, disenfranchisement, and lynching in key positions in his administration. One of these additions was Mary McLeod Bethune. Bethune was born in South Carolina to former enslaved parents and eventually became one of the most well-known educators and civil rights leaders of the 20th century. Bethune may have been Roosevelt's advisor on minority affairs, but her appointment was a major step for Black women. Farm families also struggled beyond the typical American family with declining agricultural prices, foreclosures, and drought. Their plight became visible to the rest of Americans through the photographer Dorothy Lang's migrant mother. In 1936, Lang was hired by the Farm Security Administration to photograph migrant workers to raise awareness and urge the federal government to provide them with aid. Lang went to Nipomo, California, where she encountered Florence Owens Thompson, the subject of the famous photograph. You know how sometimes people say a picture is worth 1,000 words? This was one of those times. While Roosevelt envisioned the New Deal as a broad support package to help as many Americans as possible, there were limits. Ultimately, cultural norms about race and gender shaped legislation. The ideal of a male-headed household certainly shaped policy and resulted in few women being covered by things like Social Security on their own. However, the New Deal brought some progress to women. More women earned government positions than in any previous administration. and the First Lady used her power to push for reform in civil rights and labor laws. But on the flip side, there was no organized feminist movement in the 1930s, and many calls for women, particularly married women, to exit the workforce did not pass the feminist vibe check. Aside from Lang's migrant mother, another iconic image from the Depression is the newly unemployed, breadline waiting, forgotten man. In hindsight, it's difficult to understand how most folks could not look at this photo and feel empathy, but many would not look at a photo of a woman in the same situation, desperately looking for work, and find her greedy or entitled. Nevertheless, women's wages were crucial to families' survival during the Depression, so the realities of the economy continued to pressure women to find paid work whenever and wherever they could. Once again, the Depression proved, despite cultural stereotypes, women work. By the end of this era, so much remained in question. How did gender roles ultimately shape public policy? How did racial ideologies impact the role of the New Deal? What did the federal government's neglect of women say about their status as citizens? While social factors were demanding that married women leave the workforce, economic factors were compelling them into work. How did federal programs fail to see the role that women played in the economy?
Thanks for watching. If you want to dive deeper, head over to our website, www.remedialherstory.com. You can find lesson plans, primary sources, video recommendations, and so much more. Let's make herstory.